Well, hello guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to the elevator episode. Yes, the elevator episode, or horizontal stabs if you're picky. In this episode of the F14 build from Skymaster, we are going to complete the elevator installation. So we may do the rudders in this video. At this point, I don't know, but the elevator installation is very similar to the F-18, same kind of idea, but we're gonna cover it in depth on this plane because we're using different radio system, different servos, so stay tuned and we will get the horizontal stabs put on the F-14. All right guys, and if you haven't done so already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below if you're a first timer to the channel or if you're a seasoned veteran and you have never subscribed, it's free to do so. Just hit the button right now. So we are putting the elevators on this plane. So the gear in the last episode was all installed. On the main gear, we got the airlines run, we got the gear reinstalled, we got the tanks installed, so lots of good details put in this aircraft. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start to work forward on the aircraft. That's how I like to do these things. I think the manual tells you to start with the wings. I'm not a fan of that. I like to move forward. Then we get to the wings. We've got all of our wires and stuff kind of figured out for the back end. That's why I like to do it that way. And there's a lot going on in the back portion of this plane. So we're going to do the elevators in this episode. We've also got the air brakes to deal with, the functional tail hook. We've got lots of stuff going on back here. So anyways, let's start off with these elevators. So in case you haven't watched the F-18 video, this is essentially our goal with the F-14. So the key points here with the way Skymaster does their horizontal stab surfaces. So number one, you want to have a center line going all the way through everything. So if you put your servo in here and it's shifted up or down because you're using a different brand servo, you need to adjust it so you're on the center line. These servo pockets on these aircraft were designed around 8911 JR servos. That's what's in this plane right here. In the F-14, we're going to be using an MKS servo. The other key thing is you want this servo arm to be as close to the fuselage as possible. In this case, we are pretty much rubbing the fuselage, which is what you're after. So that's kind of our goal right there with that plane. So just taking a look at this and yeah, everything with it is the same. You basically push the button when you insert your horizontal stab surface. There's a little keeper that holds that slot in place. And for a better view here, I'll push the, so I'm pushing the tab on the bottom of the fuselage. You can see the fiberglass keeper inside, the little keyhole on there. That's what's actually holding that elevator from pulling out. So you push it up, you put the elevator in, it clicks in place and holds it in place. There's bearings in there, so everything's running on bearings, and it's a very handy system and a great way to do this. So let's take a look at the servo and the servo arm that we'll be using to make these things work. All right, guys, so we are using the MKS HBL 3850s for the elevators on this plane. They're an X8 servo. What does that mean? It means the output shaft is 8 millimeters versus 6 like on most servos or their other servos. So those are the servos that we're using. So we're also using the very fancy servo arms for this thing, which is awesome. I love these things too. They look absolutely very beefy, very impressive pieces of work here. So these are nice because they look like they're a very low profile servo arm, and we should be able to get those nice and close to the fuselage. So step number one for this is we are going to just put this in the fuselage and see how it actually fits. Okay guys, so initial fit here, I haven't done anything to this opening yet. So it looks like initially we've got to do a little bit of Dremel work here on the side. There's a little bit of excess glue, but as far as output shaft location, it looks like we will be right in line with the proper spot. So it looks like we're going to be good for output shaft location. All right, so it's actually kind of nice that we're not using the JR servos, because this creates some havoc for us. So basically, problem with these servos is they're way too far in the fuselage. So we're going to have to space them out a fair bit to get that mounted in the right spot. So I think what I need to do is I need to get this servo centered. We're going to get the arm installed, because these arms are a very, very tight fit. And then what we'll do is we'll start working on the spacing of this servo and see what we can do there. So step number one, I guess, now is we need to plug the servo into the jetty system. So got to hook the jetty system up. I'm actually not stressed about it, but because I'm not familiar with it, it makes my brain have to work. So anyways, let's put the jetty radio and the other stuff together and center this servo. So this servo setup, I'm really digging these servo horns. This is a pretty cool setup, especially in a situation like this where we don't actually need to pull the servo arm off. Because the base separates from, like the red arm separates from the base, I believe. And that's a pretty slick setup. So it'll be nice to be able to put this in and be able to pull the servo horn out, just undoing those bolts there, getting the cover installed, and then bolting that back on. So pretty slick setup for sure. So this servo is done. We're going to get the other servo centered as well too, since we're also plugged in here already. And we might as well get both of those done. So I'll do those, and then we'll work on the spacing on the aircraft. One other nice little thing about these servo arms is, because of all the different positions, you can find center without using any sub trim in the radio. So all I was doing was moving it over a couple splines, sliding the red thing, checking the position with my square. Nope, not quite square. So I'd go to the next set, next set, next set, and eventually we found the perpendicular line on the servo. So both of the servos are set up without any sub trim. All right, so we're going to figure out how thick of spacers we need here. So we're going to take these MKS stickers, because those together are a great amount of space to keep the servo arm away from the fuselage. And we'll just take our calipers here, if that'll work. I don't know if we can get in there. We'll use the old-fashioned ones, because they're a little bit smaller. That'll work. Sometimes the old tools are better. That shows that we need an 11 millimeter spacer on the top and the same on the bottom. All right, guys, so when I measured that, I got 11 millimeters, but the thing I didn't take into account was the width of the flange on the servo. So what we need to do is we've got 11 millimeters minus whatever the thickness of the mounting flange is, which is 3 millimeters. And that means our spacer needs to be 8 millimeters thick. All right, guys, so we've got the first set of spacers installed. So this is some, I think 1/8 ply with carbon laminates on it. So I put 2 layers of that on, and it's not quite enough. So I installed the servo, put it in its space here, and the arm was just hitting the inside flange here, or the inside recess. So what I've done is I've cut up some G10 spacers, which is this stuff right here. And I think this is going to be the right thickness, because we've got the thickness of the flange plus just a little bit to put those pieces of paper in there. So I think that's going to be a great combination of everything. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just glue those on the back of this spacer setup, and then we'll see if that fits. Now, one thing to think about when you're doing this is now we don't have the opportunity to use the stock screws, right? If we use the stock screws, all we're grabbing on is the spacers. You got to remember that, because if you're only grabbing on the spacers, your glue between the spacers and your former work is the only thing that this is mounting to. So not a terrible thing, but I would rather also screw into the former work that's in the plane, which is nice thick aircraft ply. And that's going to be a way better way to do this. So we could just glue these spacers on there, but not a great way to do it. Also, if you add the spacers on the fuselage, then you run into the issue of getting the servo installed because you're dealing with the cable. So it is a better system to put the spacers on the servo itself. All right, guys, so that is a great combination here, and I'll try and show you the gap, but there is just a nice little gap there. So we are extremely tight to the fuselage, which is what we're after. So again, we want to make sure that we are on the center line of the output shaft, or the shaft of the elevators. So we do have a little bit of play here because I created that play when I sanded the opening. So we need to, when we put the servo in, push it up, and then we are in line with the hole. Now I have cut pieces for the other side. Now we can't assume that they're going to match perfectly, so we may need to adjust the thickness on all this stuff, but we have cut pieces for the other side as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to push that servo up a little bit, and we are going to drill holes through the spacer and everything, and then we will get some nice screws to get everything installed. All right, so we've got one of these screws installed. I'll just show you my process here. So these are number 4 screws, and they've got a hex head on them. So if we line this up like that, basically we've got the screw going all the way through the former work that's inside the plane. So that's what you're looking for. And then so what I've done in this case is I've used a larger drill bit to go through the spacer and everything on here. And then once we get through that last G10 piece that's on the back side touching the fuselage, then I switch to a smaller drill bit and we go through the former work in the fuselage. So anyways, that is basically what we're doing. So good setup, happy with it. And of course we've added a large washer on there as well to provide lots of contact surface. So once that servo gets screwed in, it will be absolutely rock solid. All right, and we are all bolted in with that servo. Worked out very, very nicely. So keep in mind too that I had a bit of a big gap here before, so I was able to put this, these stickers in. There was a bit of a gap, but as soon as you tighten that down, everything kind of squishes a little bit, right? So you don't want this to be too tight, and then you squish everything down. So this worked out exactly what I wanted it to do. So that is amazing. All right, so let's take a look here at the servo horns. So this is a stock horn setup. The distance from center to center is 19 millimeters. So we've got 2 holes on the MKS servo horn here. So we've got one at 19, one at 21. Don't make the mistake of using the longer one. If you use the longer one, your bearing setup will not fit in the surface. It generally will hit the end of the little pocket that fits into. So don't make that mistake. Anyway, so we're going to use the closer one. So what we're going to do now is we're going to pull this servo horn off, and we need to create a recessed area for the setup to go into. Now the nice thing about this setup is we are a little bit thicker on the servo arm itself. Hopefully that doesn't cause us any issues, but it definitely gives us some more contact area. So let's pull the servo horn off. Okay, so we've got the other servo arm set up. We drilled the servo arm and then we used a countersink bit to create the angled area, basically to match the servo horn that came with the aircraft. So what I like to do on this area is, number one, I've put this in all the way and checked that it's actually flush with the back, which is good, it's done. And what I like to do is I like to use red Loctite on the back here. So I'll put some on the angled head and we'll do all this up and we'll be ready to reinstall the servo arm. All right, and there we go. We are installed and ready to go. So you can see on the back side here that we are flush with the servo arm. So as I mentioned, I do like that these are a little bit thicker. Hopefully it doesn't cause us any issues. Okay, so now what we can do is we can basically do the cutouts on the cover plates for this servo arm. So that's the next thing we have to do. And so there's the cover plate that goes on here. We basically need to be able to slip that cover plate over and then reinstall the servo arm. Now, that's one other thing that I actually really like about this setup on this MKS servo is you can just pull this piece off, especially on these Skymaster aircraft. And now we have access to just take that cover plate on and off, or in my case, get it installed. So I think that's pretty awesome. So we're going to work on those cover plates next. So all I've done here is we've got the cover plate lined up, one axis here, just marked the center line, and the first one I did was the vertical, and basically just carried that up. So now we know our center point is right there for the hole. Now fortunately, we ordered these servo arms separately, so we've got one of these pieces here. So all we need to do is get that lined up in the center. So you're probably not going to be able to see it, but you can see through the center of the hole. So we're going to get that lined up, draw a circle around it, and we're just going to Dremel that out. And there's our mark there. So what I'll do is I'll take my step bit now, start off in the center and just keep going until we're close. And if I need to clean that hole up a little bit, we can just use our Dremel. So perfect time in the video to thank each and every one of you that have donated to the Shop Build Fund. Really appreciate it. As I say in every single video, it's absolutely awesome. Thank you so much for the donations. Whether they have been big or small, every little bit is very, very helpful. So thank you, thank you, thank you to each and every one of you that have donated to the Shop Build. Very appreciated. All right, and when you're drilling stuff like this, I find using, I don't know if you guys watching this use pin vices, but I've had these things for a long time. And so pin vices are awesome. They hold these little drill bits and great little tools. When you're doing these small screws, you definitely don't want to use CA on them. The Skymaster screws, as soon as you use CA on them, and just because of the general size, you'll be tightening it up and it'll just strip the head right out. So just a little warning for you, don't use CA in this spot. Okay, so what I do is drill a hole with the appropriate drill bit size, take my countersink bit, and you don't need to use a tool, I find, when you're working on the small stuff. Make a little countersink and screw it in. Now if you do happen to snap one of these heads off, hopefully there's enough sticking out like that. Oh, it's nice to catch this on camera. So there was a little bit of resistance when I was screwing that in, and that's what we're left with, is this little nub. So what a great time for a tip time, brought to you by trusty bent screwdriver. All right, so what I use, I found these pliers in an old toolbox that I bought. I actually was given the old toolbox, made in England, and they're really slick because they stay flat the whole time. So usually with something like this, I find that this particular tool works very well. Holds onto the screw nicely and able to get that out. So great example of how careful you have to be with these Skymaster screws. So what I'll do in this case is take a larger drill bit and drill that out. I think in this case we're drilling into some glue or fiberglass or something. Yeah, and it's even that drill bit is getting sticky. So anyways, but that's how we get that out. Now if you snap off the head and it's really flush, I find the best thing to do is just re-drill it and try and be as accurate as possible. But hopefully as you're screwing that in, you have the opportunity to just grab what's left and get that screw out. All right, and there we are. So the cover's been installed. Now what we can do is reinstall the servo arm like that. And we'll just check our tolerances and clearances and everything. And that looks awesome. And that means the next thing we can do is get all of our little screws reinstalled. So we're going to use blue Loctite here. Of course we're using Loctite. And we'll skip a hole, put the next one in. And we'll skip a hole and put the next one in. So before we go too crazy on this setup, we are going to make sure that it actually works. Okay, so we still need to install the back piece here, the receiver portion of this setup. But what I do now at this point is just check the fit of everything and just confirm that we are on the right track. And one thing I find that really is helpful with this whole setup is just put a thin layer of machine oil on the shaft going into the receiver, and just helps everything slide a lot better. All right guys, so unfortunately these servos here will not work with this setup. You have to have a servo arm that has an offset towards the outside with the actual arm itself. I'll show you here why. So we're not clipped in yet, but the bolts holding the red arm onto the silver receiver, they're preventing the surface from going in all the way. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull those bolts out and just see if the surface even clips in when we fasten that all down. So unfortunately guys, even without any fasteners on this, the general servo arm itself, these awesome MKS servo arms are just too big. They will not work. So unfortunately, this setup is no good. We're going to have to go with the 6mm output shaft and use the Skymaster servo arms. So there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, it would have been really nice if this would have worked. So anyways, we need to assess and we'll come back and report. All right, so what we're going to do here guys is we are going to use this 8mm output shaft servo somewhere else. Maybe the rudders. The benefit of using it on the rudders is we can sand this servo arm down to be exactly what we want it to be. So we might use it on the rudders, or if not, we may use it on the flaps or somewhere else. So anyways, what we're going to do is we're going to install the brushless 599 servos. A little bit lower spec on these guys, but at 8.2 volts, it's still 45 kilograms of torque. So that still is a awesome servo. So, but this will work with the stock servo arms. So we have to reassess the spacing and everything. I really hope that this is exactly the same dimensions as those servos, but obviously we're going to pull this out and check it out. So one of those great scenarios where I'm sharing my successes and failures with you guys. Not that this is a failure, it's a good learning experience, especially for anybody that's wanting to build one of these F-14 aircraft. It's important to have all these details ironed out, and hopefully this can help you guys learn. I just want to take a quick second to show you guys, I got my Revit bag order for the Huracan aircraft. If you saw my social media posts, they did not have the shape for these bags. So what you do is you send a bunch of dimensions to Revit. You can contact me if you're interested in this and they don't have your bags. You can send a bunch of dimensions to Revit. They send you a test set of bags. You put your surfaces in those test bags, send back a picture. They adjust it based on that, and we have a beautiful set of Revit bags for the Huracan with my logo. Absolutely awesome. All right, guys, well, I've been fighting with the spacing on this right elevator for about an hour and 30 minutes right now, and ready to pull my hair out. So this is the right elevator, and I went to the piece that fits inside the elevator, the little receiver piece, and I was like, maybe we should look at the other side. So if you take a look at this one, this is the right elevator, how far it sticks out. And then you take a look at the left one. So the former work here is inset more, which is what I'm used to. And on this one, the former work is outset. Basically the back end here, the trailing end here is almost flush with the root of the skin or the root of the surface. So that's our problem, is this former was spaced out just a hair too far. So what we need to do in this case is we need to do a little bit of sanding on the wood where this receiver goes into. So that's what we are working on now. It's really close to fitting, but I have adjusted the spacers on this servo so we are as close as we can get. And you can actually see there we are rubbing, which is actually where you want it. You want it to have a little bit of rubbing on the fuselage that gets covered by the surface. But that, I mean, we can't go any tighter, right? And it's just preventing us from clipping that servo in. So, all right, and nothing's tight, but we successfully got it. So I'll pull this apart and I'll show you guys what I did to solve that problem. Okay, so basically I took my Dremel bit, and these Dremel bits that I have or use, they're a carbide bit, but they've got a flat end, so a smooth end, which works out well in this situation, because what you do is you just get your first little bit started at the depth you want, and then you can go along, and it pretty much doesn't grind into anything depth-wise. But, so anyways, that's what we did. Now this isn't the most amazing design, because Skymaster has this foam stuff and then the plywood's on the inside. So it's actually not a bad thing that we ended up doing this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put some foam safe CA all over this, and we're basically going to harden all of this foam up and make sure that it doesn't compress. Now, as we've done on other aircraft in the past, and it says in the instruction booklet, before you take this piece and put it in, you actually end up putting epoxy all over the receiver or the wood itself. And what that does is it takes up all the little gaps. So really, it's not the screws that are holding it in place. They're just, well, obviously they're holding it in place, but it's the structure in here that are preventing it from turning, and the screws just preventing that piece from falling out. So not absolutely critical that this is wood, but it's nice if we're cinching this down to not have it be on foam. So I'm going to work on that a little bit, and then we'll be ready to put this guy together. All right, so we've got both of the tail surfaces complete. So it's funny because the first one took me And don't judge, but the first one took me about 5 hours to figure out because we had that servo issue. So when I put the other servo in, the 599, I think, the second servos we put in there, the spacing was all different. So sorting all that stuff out, this one took about an hour to get 100% complete. So yeah, it's nice to have this part complete. Next thing we're gonna do is we are gonna put the receiver portions in the horizontal stab surfaces. That's the last thing to do on these surfaces. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so first thing we wanna do, this is the left surface. What we wanna do is we wanna screw those screws in so we can put some CA in there to pre-treat the holes. Okay, so now what we'll do is we will pull the receiver piece out and put some CA in those holes so that can harden up and we can get the other receiver piece installed. Okay, so just to give you guys an explanation of why we're doing what we're doing here. So when we put this receiver piece in there, you can see there's a little bit of play. Okay, so this opening is larger than that piece. So if you don't put epoxy all over the opening when you put this in, what's happening is all that force that is on this surface is directly on those screw heads. So you want to put epoxy on here, insert this. So what that does is it fills the gap between the receiver and the surface, and it spreads that force out over the actual structure in this surface versus just on those two screws. So extremely important step. Not overly complicated, but what we do, or the way I do this is I generally use trusty bent screwdriver because it's the perfect tool for everything. And I'll put some epoxy all over the opening here, just a nice decent layer. And then what you want to do is you want to put some thin oil all over this receiver piece. So I'll just use shock oil or light machine oil, and that prevents the epoxy from sticking to this receiver, because if you ever want to change this receiver out, you want to be able to get it out. If you epoxy it in there, you're never getting it out. So once the epoxy's in there, once your oil's on here, you insert this, screw it down, let it cure, and that is a very strong connection to those surfaces. So I'm going to get that done, and I'll show you guys the steps here. So we've got our Hysol 9462 mixed up, so we'll take some of this and just put a nice layer all over this section, like that. Now what we want to do is we want to put some light oil over top of the receiver pieces. So I'll just take some shock oil, silicone shock oil, and we'll just put a thin layer. All over the back side. And then now what we do is we insert that into the surface. Like that. Now there'll be a little bit of excess in there. We'll clean that out in a little bit here. And then we just screw it down. So nice and firm. That's why putting that CA in those holes and pre-screwing them and everything is important. Like that. So then what we'll do is we'll just take our cloth here, put some rubbing alcohol on it, and we'll just clean up those little bits that are kind of protruding past or into the receiver area. All right, guys, so we have everything set up on the elevators for this aircraft, or I shouldn't call them elevators. I should be calling them tailor-ons, horizontal stabs, whatever, but there we go. So that's aileron movement, that's elevator movement. Looks awesome. So because the programming for this aircraft on the jetty system has already been, it's from a previous F14 plane, we've already got all the programming set up. So I'll double check it for sure, but I'm sure the distance or the travel on those surfaces are from the previous plane, and we should be good. All right, and we did get a very cool delivery from my 3D printer guy. So Joe, thanks for punching these things out so quickly. So what are these little things right here? Let's talk about that. So one of the downsides with the F-14 gear, and this is just the nature of the way this plane is this is your locking cylinder for the wishbone here, dog bone, I don't know what it's called, but this is what locks it. So when the plane's on, pressure's on, all that stuff, this is totally fine because it's got air pressure in it, holding this thing locked or holding it unlocked when it's retracting, which is great. But if you're taxiing this plane back, you turn the power off, there's no more pressure in this cylinder. So it's probably fine if you're driving forward and the gear's got pressure going backwards on it. But let's say you start backing into a parking spot for the plane, puts pressure on this side of the wheel, it's pretty easy for these gear to collapse. So what I've gotten Joe to make is a little clip here that goes over top of the shaft itself. And we're gonna put a little remove before flight tag on there. So ideally what happens is you do this as part of your shutdown procedure. So you're flying your plane, you land the plane, you taxi back, maybe you turn the engines off, and then what you do is while the engines are cooling down, you're clipping your little anti-movement device onto the actual cylinder itself, and that's going to prevent this gear from collapsing when you don't want it to. So great little feature. I just reached out to Joe, drew something up. He did this up for me, so I don't have any plans of having these listed on the website, but we got a bunch of them printed because you want to have extras. So anyways, those are a little touch there, a little scale touch, but also a functional touch as well. Check. All right, and one of the last steps here in this elevator video is the metal receiver piece that's right inside the rear portion of the fuselage here. We want to check those fastening bolts and nuts that hold that one and that one in place. The front section here is just a pin that goes in, and then your bolt fastens to the fuselage, so there's just a receiver in the back section. So if you look right there, that's what we're tightening up. So we've got 4 bolts per pin, and we just want to make sure we snug those things up and they are nice and tight. Generally you'll find with those things they are usually loose from the factory. And this is just my thoughts, but maybe they put the plane together, it's nice and humid over in wherever they put these planes together. The wood gets here, it shrinks down a little bit, lower moisture content, at least in our climate, and there's a bit of play in those fasteners. So just one last little thing to double check before we start putting any more in the back section of this aircraft. All right guys, and that is everything for this video. Obviously we focused purely on the horizontal stabs, and we are done that portion of this aircraft. So I'm happy that we ran into that challenge, because obviously we know that we can't use those servos from now on in this scenario. So it's kind of a nice learning experience as well. So if you're building one of these planes or any of the Skymaster planes with this type of tail setup, make sure you go with a servo that will work with their stock servo horn and bearing setup, because nothing else really works that well or at all. All right, so that's it for this video. The next video, we are gonna move into the vertical stabs or the rudders, and that's gonna be a nice challenge as well. There's a couple different ways to do those things, internal, external, but that is the next thing that we'll be working on in our quest to move forward in this plane literally as well. So we'll do the rudders in the next video, maybe work on the tail section with the cones and stuff depending on how the rudders go, but that's the focus of the next video. So thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to give the video one of these things. Hit that subscribe button down below if you haven't done so already, and we'll see you in the next video.